Hello everyone, it's GigaBeef here, and today, in light of Tarkov's recent changes, mostly through Nikita's posts on Reddit, it's time that we looked at the most glaring quality of life issues remaining in the game, and maybe some solutions too. Before we start, I do stream on Twitch and I keep my schedule updated on Twitter, so when I'm live, you can come and ask me questions in real time. So first and foremost, the number one quality of life issue for Tarkov right now is queuing in for raids. This takes far too long between all of the loading, the matching, and finally waiting for players, and if there are some slow PCs in the lobby, you can be waiting for a really long time. I looked back at the last 12 raids that I did across most of the maps to get an idea, and the longest time was on streets with just shy of 5 minutes total from the moment that you press ready to the game view actually appearing, and the shortest being 1 minute 45 seconds for factory. My machine does load in pretty quick these days, so typically I'm waiting for players to start the raid, so if you have a slower PC, then you'll likely experience times even longer than this more consistently. Now obviously the most clear solution is to reduce the loading times, but this can be technologically complex and difficult to achieve when some players are using outdated hardware. However, Tarkov has a bunch of other out-of-raid downtime through stash management. Player satisfaction could be significantly improved by implementing access to these features whilst loading into a raid, and I see 3 stages to this, the most basic being access to the stash only. If nothing else, this would at least allow you to organise your inventory, junk boxes, ammo, and other stuff whilst waiting for a game, which would be a big win. You'd likely have to lock your PMC once the raid equipment was chosen in order to avoid any problems, but outside of this, anything in the regular stash could be moved around as you like. Stage 2 would be access to the Flea Market as well, allowing players to sell items from previous raids whilst loading into the next one. As a non-expert, this is as far as I think is technologically possible, but I would be very satisfied with these 2 features. Stage 3 would be access to the Hideout, but because this loads a bit like a map itself and taxes the PC somewhat, it could cause performance issues with the Hideout rendering whilst loading into a normal raid, and it's not really that necessary. Hideout management typically takes much less time than the rest of the stash, especially considering that you could still sell the outputs of crafts whilst loading in if stage 2 is reached. While we're on the topic of the Hideout, a frame limiter for the Hideout itself would be excellent. Something about the Hideout and the way that it's rendered used to make my old machine sound like it was about to take off, and although it's not as bad on my new rig, it still pushes the hardware unnecessarily hard. You can use the game limiter to prevent rendering a huge FPS in the Hideout, but having to toggle it on and off and Nvidia Reflex as well so that it's even enabled is not practical. Next, reordering of favourite crafts. The addition of the favourite system so you don't have to scroll through the entire crafts list to access some of these was added recently, and it is really good, looking at you Workbench 3, but to get them in a preferred order, you have to unfavourite and then refavourite them in that specific order, which is a bit annoying. For the med station level 3, the vitality skill block needs to go. This does nothing other than punish careful players that don't get shot very much, so either vitality itself needs a rework or the skill blocker needs to be removed. All this does is incentivize those players that don't get to vitality 3 by the time med 3 is close to go onto shoreline or wherever their preferred spot is and damage themselves in barbed wire to level the skill. There are already hideout prerequisites and trader level requirements that in turn imply level requirements. If you've made it there, you shouldn't get punished for not getting shot as much as another similar player, it just makes no sense. Finally, for the hideout is the ability to turn in hideout upgrades as you go along. This was added to the quest system some time back, but currently we still have to hold all our hideout items until completion for each upgrade, and only then can they be used to upgrade the modules. Right, onto the Flea Market. There's not actually that much here, but the main thing is to remove the capture, or at least diminish how aggressively it activates. As a regular but fast user of the Flea Market, the capture shouldn't really be able to show up, but I get it fairly regularly when buying items in bulk for crafting or hideout upgrades, and it's seriously annoying. In the past, this was there to prevent botting, but with the find in raid system, it's not like you can flip resell items like you could previously, because once purchased, they can no longer be put on the Flea Market. I see very little evidence of botting anymore on the Flea, and maybe I'm misguided on this, but to be perfectly honest, it's not like it would be that hard to circumvent if you were really determined, as the capture pictures are all just the standard images from the game's loot pool. Ultimately, it's annoying for the genuine player base, and a non-issue for those who it's designed to fight against. The only other thing that I would really like for the Flea itself would be a more useful back button. When searching for barter inputs or using the linked search, it would be amazing to be able to step back to your last search. In testing this, I discovered that if you search for something like an ammo box and look for one of the barter components, you can get back to the first search for item by pressing tab and tab again, in this case the container. But being able to go back to the last filter by item on the market would save a lot of time when moving through chains of related items rather than having to start the linked search from the root every time you make a mistake. Next up onto the inventory itself. First up, pinned items for the auto sort so that they don't move. This has been spoken about a lot and is planned every time it comes up, so I do believe this is coming, but without it, auto sort is practically useless once you have a couple of cases. Related to this, the ability to auto-sort using a bottom-up method rather than top-down would allow keeping space at the top of the stash rather than the bottom. Keeping some space at the top is used by many players to control-click items into the stash after a raid, and between these two features, auto-sort would be much more useful. Auto-sorting in containers works really well for the most part, but ammo boxes sort in some strange way, which appears to be the order in which they were added to the game. This would be much better if organised by caliber, as the current method makes a bit of a mess of things. Another relatively new-ish addition, the sorting table is very useful when tetrising a full stash and has a unique feature. When it's open, using shift and left click moves items into it, but this should work for other cases as well. If you only have one case open, shift left click should move items into that case too, and perhaps as a small extension, if the sorting table is open as well as a container, the shift left click would also move items into the open container. This would allow you to shift click barter items into junk boxes straight from your inventory, for example. In a similar way, a multi-select that would allow you to move batches of items at once would also be extremely helpful for either moving things up and down in the stash or bulk moving into containers. The existing drag and drop of items could also be improved by implementing a drop to the next available slot within a certain distance to help against small misclicks where at the moment it just cancels the item move altogether if you drag an item over another one. Onto loadout presets. This is another feature that has been coming for a long time that would really help to speed up the turnaround for certain regular kits. Even something relatively basic, just for items like bags, rigs, armor and helmets would be useful, but if it could be set up for things like mags in rigs, hotkeyed items for pockets and the secure container too, this would be the icing on the cake. It takes a really long time to reorder everything, especially if you're changing caliber, so this could help minimize the stash time for experienced players. On this note, having an ammo packing tool with saved presets would also be handy. While not as important as the presets, some players do like to have all kinds of funky mag setups, but some of them are not practical, such as the 2 cartridges alternating. The other ammo management issue right now is the find in raid status and how it works with magazine controls, which has been amplified by lots of the best ammo being craft only. Let's say you're using 5.56 and crafting M995 in the hideout. After the first raid you run with this, the M995 that's left over and you bring back will no longer be find in raid. This means that for any spare depleted stacks in your secure container or half full magazines, the find in raid ammo from your stash is no longer allowed to be topped up or loaded into the mags on top of non-find in raid ammo. This is because the game never wants to delete the find in raid status automatically without the player knowing, as they might have wanted to sell certain ammos on the flea market, but most of these can't be sold on the flea anymore anyway. Personally, I think there should be an option in the right-click menu for ammo to remove find in raid status, a warning that asks if you want to continue for top-up and mag loading actions that will result in a removal of find in raid status, and potentially even bypass this completely and just let it go through if the ammo isn't even sellable on the flea. The last few things for the inventory, a way to place tools into the hideout for continuous use. With the addition of auxiliary items, these get used again and again and again on craft completion and then get dumped back into the stash. There should be a tool case or some special screen in the hideout or something that allows them to be returned there once used, as it's really annoying to have to put them back in the junk boxes over and over again. Or if you accidentally sell one and have to rebuy it to do a craft. The same could be said for kappa items. This ever-growing list of random things that is needed for the endgame quest should really have its own special expensive case for keeping these things in throughout the wipe. So weapons modding, I actually have very few issues with because the system is pretty good, but the ability to linked search on an empty slot would be very useful. This should just bring up those things that fit into that slot specifically, for example foregrips, lights or optics, and stops us from having to navigate through layers of submenus to get to the parts that we're actually interested in. Alright, on to the final section, playing the actual game. Firstly, some basic ammo stats in Raid. Yes, we all use the wiki at this point, but I think we're at the stage where some idea of what each cartridge does, at least for damage, and broadly what its penetration effectiveness is against different armor would be a big quality of life upgrades for new players. Now, I did have removed turn rate debuffs from armor and helmets on this list, but as that got reduced recently on my Reddit post, thanks everyone for the upvotes, and with Nikita saying it was going to be removed in the future, we can probably cross this one off. Next is zeroing. Now I've talked about this before, but this really does need to be addressed in a game that prizes itself on the more realistic elements of weapon simulation. The current system of zeroing for a default and hidden, may I add, cartridge for each weapon is obscure, unintuitive, and bizarre. There have been many solutions proposed in the past, but Dan Exert's presentation on picking around for each weapon before the raid is my favourite. This would allow you to set the caliber that the weapon is zeroed for before you enter a raid, giving attentive players some agency here, but without causing issues like the zeroing point magically moving around if instead you were to automatically zero for each bullet, for example. On that note, other aspects of weapons such as the fire mode, so single or full auto, laser and flashlight settings, and optics modes should also be possible to set before the raid. Perhaps this could be done somewhere in the shooting range. Regarding scopes, all experienced players at this stage are aware of the big performance hit that you take for using any that are picture-in-picture. While this is a really cool feature generally, this can make ranged optics simply unusable for some players, driving them to use hollows or red dots in every raid and just making do if they have outdated computers. The ability to choose between having the peripheral vision rendered or not would be very useful for these players, basically as if you were closing your left eye when using the optic. When Lighthouse came out, I would certainly have used this before I upgraded my CPU, as on the sniping map I had 30 FPS with any picture-in-picture scope. To be clear, this would strictly be a disadvantage for those who have it turned on, but for many it's a trade-off that they'd be willing to make to get better performance while sniping. With offline co-op, this has been slowly getting better and better, but right now you have to have 2 players to use all of the features. Please let us load into offline co-op by ourselves, or at least have those settings utilised in the standard local offline. Finally, the option to play as a standard account, even if you own EOD. There are a number of players that would like to experience the full game despite owning an EOD account, as the extra challenge and reward of the smaller stash, alpha container, and lower trader rep can extend the game for some people and give them more to do. So there's certainly some stuff that I've left out, and if you have any other suggestions then do feel free to leave them down in the comments. Otherwise, as usual, a big shout out to all my patrons, hit all the buttons if you enjoyed the video, and as always, have fun in your raids.